I'm Rob Simpson. I'm going to present evidence for a shipwreck buried slightly inland in the state of Victoria in Australia. The shipwreck has been completely buried by sand and lost for more than 130 years. The lost sailing ship, perhaps resembling these model sailing ships, is known as the Mahogany Ship. It is one of Australia's most baffling and tantalising mysteries. Over more than a century, numerous expeditions have been unable to find it. Much of the evidence I'm going to present is taken from two books: The Mahogany Ship, Relic or Legend, published in 1987, and The Mahogany Ship, A Survey of the Evidence, published in 2003. Victoria is a southern state of Australia. It was first settled by Europeans during the 19th century. Many sailing ships were wrecked in a rugged area known as the Shipwreck Coast. Some of the ships were stranded on the beaches, or even further inland. The lost site of the Mahogany Ship is in sand dunes known as hummocks between the Australian coastal city of Warrnambool and the coastal town of Port Fairy. The hummocks area west of Warrnambool is about 12 kilometres or 7.5 miles wide along the ocean front. The terrain is quite rugged. The sand in the hummocks is not free-flowing but compact and is protected by grass and other low-lying vegetation. A large number of 19th century newspaper articles, diaries and letters report inland shipwrecks on the Shipwreck Coast. They were wooden sailing ships that had once been marooned and were nearly buried by wind-blown sand by the mid-19th century. It is not possible today to know exactly how many stranded shipwrecks were once visible above the sand, but anecdotal evidence points to at least 3. When the sand finally covered them completely in the late 19th century, they were lost to sight, and their exact locations became the subject of conjecture. Once buried and lost, relocating a shipwreck was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A small minority of the reports mention a shipwreck that was the colour of mahogany, which doesn't necessarily mean that it was constructed of mahogany. It is highly unlikely that the Mahogany Ship was actually built of mahogany, but the mysterious lost shipwreck became known as the Mahogany Ship. I'm going to present evidence that the exact location of a buried shipwreck has been found in the hummocks 11 kilometres or 7 miles west of Warrnambool. A local businessman, John Mason, wrote this about one of the shipwrecks in 1876.
Riding along the beach from Port Fairy to Warrnambool in the summer of 1846, my attention was attracted to the hull of a vessel embedded high and dry on the hummocks, far above the reach of any tide. The hull was full of drift sand. The timber of which she was built had the appearance of cedar or mahogany. The wreck lies about midway between Port Fairy and Warrnambool, and is probably by this time entirely covered with drift sand.
Warrnambool and Port Fairy are 21 kilometres or 13 miles apart as the crow flies. The Prince's Highway runs through the area to the north. Gorman's Road, known as Gorman's Lane in the 19th century, travels south from the highway to the beach. Immediately north of the Prince's Highway is Tower Hill Wildlife Reserve. Tower Hill is a dormant volcano. It is the most prominent landmark between Warrnambool and Port Fairy, and is often mentioned as a reference point in literature about the Mahogany Ship. Tower Hill is rich in Australian wildlife. Only one Mahogany Ship report contains coordinates that indicate a truly specific location in the hummocks, and that is the testimony of Alexander Rollo, a resident of a nearby town during the 19th century. In 1890, Mr. Rollo wrote a letter to the Warrnambool newspaper, The Standard, that states in part,
"In the years 1854 and 1855, when residing at South Warrnambool, I and others were in the habit of walking along the beach. I remember a wreck that was lying far above high water mark, her stern pointed towards Port Fairy, and only her timbers were standing about 3 or 4 feet above the sand, surrounded with vegetation. From the position and appearance of the wreck, I am perfectly sure she came ashore before the district was inhabited by white people. She could not be seen from the water's edge, being high up in the hummocks."
3 or 4 feet is about a metre. Most of the shipwreck was buried by the middle of the 19th century. If the stern was pointing towards Port Fairy, then the prow must have been pointing towards Warrnambool. It is recorded that Mr. Rollo described the exact position of the shipwreck.
"The wreck was a quarter of a mile east of Gorman's Lane and 4 chains north from the sea."
A quarter of a mile is 402 metres. 4 chains is 88 yards, which is 80 metres. This is the scene at the exact location today. The shipwreck, of course, was completely buried by sand during the 19th century. The site is south of Tower Hill. Let us now look at the site from above, using the technique of aerial archaeology. Aerial photography as an archaeological aid has been used by archaeologists worldwide since the invention of flight. It helps archaeologists to understand exactly where to carry out their investigations, because buried buildings, or parts of them such as the remaining foundations, can be identified much more readily from the air than at ground level. When seen from above, irregularities in the earth, sand and vegetation commonly betray the symmetrical shapes of human-made objects beneath. Many buried structures have been discovered by this method, especially in countries that are renowned for their ancient civilizations. Aerial archaeology is not, of course, a technique of seeing through the earth. It is seeing from a height anomalies on the surface of the earth caused by objects underneath. Typically, these irregularities cannot be distinguished at ground level because they are so close to the viewer. Many famous archaeological sites have been discovered by this method. Here is one. In 1928, an aeroplane pilot flying over farmland near the town of Caister in England noticed a large symmetrical pattern. A photo was taken, which subsequently caused a media sensation. Archaeological investigation showed that buried beneath the field were the streets, walls and buildings of a 2,000-year-old Roman town. Using Google Earth, I zoomed in on the site. After zooming in, it is necessary to use historical imagery. Click on View, then on Historical Imagery, and a bar will appear. Slide the pointer to the extreme left. Then I used Google Earth Ruler to measure a quarter of a mile, or 402 metres east of Gorman's Lane. Then I measured 88 yards, or 80 metres north from the sea. To use the Google Earth Ruler, click on Tools, Ruler. Now zoom in further. At exactly the distances indicated by Rollo from Gorman's Lane and the sea, it is possible to see the imprints of large symmetrical shapes that could not have been created by nature. The wavy line near the top is a track, appropriately named the Mahogany Walking Track. The pale patch at the bottom of the picture is the beach. Using a photo program, I gave the image some more contrast. Then I added yellow lines to make the shapes easier to see. Sailing ships often broke up when wrecked. The largest shape is 125 feet long, which is 38 metres. The smallest section is 110 feet long, which is 33 metres. There also appears to be a small section just to the north of the Mahogany Walking Track. I moved the smaller shape to show what the ship might originally have looked like. The evidence of aerial archaeology supports the Rollo claim that
The wreck was a quarter of a mile east of Gorman's Lane and 4 chains north from the sea.
thanks to the Google Earth ruler, it is possible to measure the exact distances of the symmetrical shapes from the Mahogany Walking Track and other features. At the site, these measurements can be recreated by using a tape measure. By this method, I found the exact position of each of the shapes at the site. At exactly where the hull-shaped outline can be seen on the Google Earth aerial image, there is a hollow in the sand that is reminiscent of the shape of the hull of a ship. I am walking down into it. There is still more evidence that this would be the site of a buried shipwreck. In his 1890 letter to the Warrnambool Standard, Mr. Rollo made this claim.
She could not be seen from the water's edge, being high up in the hummocks.
I'm walking from the shipwreck site to the beach. It's quite true that you can't see the shipwreck site from the water's edge because the low hummock is in the way. Mr. Rollo also had this to say.
It was opposite Helen Rock.
Helen Rock is an underwater feature in the ocean to the south of the area. It must have been a danger to ships and would have been well known to local inhabitants in the 19th century. Maps show that Helen Rock is directly south of the site. Mr. Rollo is also recorded as making this statement.
The wreck was between 2 hummocks.
He claimed that there were 2 hummocks parallel to the beach, a low one to the south and a higher one to the north. The shipwreck was lying between them, also parallel to the beach. This is exactly what we have found. Mr. Rollo is responsible for a diagram of the site, although it is not the work of a particularly accomplished artist. The diagram is drawn from the east. 2 asterisks, or stars, show that there were 2 sections of the shipwreck lying on the inside slope and towards the base of the low hummock. I have made a computerized version of the diagram showing from left to right the sea, the beach, the low hummock to the south, the 2 sections of the shipwreck and the high hummock to the north. There are indeed 2 rows of hummocks at the location. A lower row to the south, a higher row to the north, and a valley in between, precisely as in the diagram. In my opinion, the 2 stars in the Rollo diagram represent the 2 largest sections of the shipwreck, parts of which were still visible above the sand in the mid-19th century. Science has shown that up to 15 metres or 49 feet of sand has blown onto the Warrnambool hummocks during the past 2 centuries. Now I'm going to turn the aerial image upside down so that we can understand the site as it would be viewed from the north. This is the view from the top of the high hummock immediately to the north of the site. The 2 stars on the site correspond exactly to the 2 stars on the diagram. Notice the depression precisely where the hull shape can be seen from above. There is even more evidence. A letter written in 1909 says that a person named James Rock, a resident of the district for 61 years, said he knew the wreck well, having to pass it on his way to Port Fairy. He said that it was near Gorman's Lane and that he could still locate the position.
There was a channel cut through the hummocks by Mr. Rutledge to drain a large area of swamp considerably east of Gorman's Lane. The wreck lies about halfway between Gorman's Lane and this channel, but, if anything, nearer the channel than Gorman's Lane.
Rutledge's cutting, created manually by farmers during the 19th century to drain a swamp, is to the east of Gorman's Lane. The shipwreck is indeed
About halfway between Gorman's Lane and this channel, but, if anything, nearer the channel than Gorman's Lane.
This is exactly the same location as the Rollo site. Even if the channel had widened somewhat since then, it would still allow the rock location to be identical to the Rollo location. On the balance of probabilities, this should be the position of a shipwreck that was partly visible above the sand in the 19th century and subsequently completely buried. In 1980, Mrs. Dickey, a prosperous local resident aged 84, claimed that
the Mahogany Ship was very close to the end of Gorman's Lane, a little to the east. A large spar or mast was visible sticking up out of the sand.
the location could be described accurately as
very close to the end of Gorman's Lane, a little to the east.
a local Church of England Sunday school had a picnic at the end of Gorman's Lane in 1876 that was attended by Mrs. Daisy Smith's mother. In 1980, 84-year-old Mrs. Smith wrote,
It had not been seen for some years, but at the picnic somebody saw the ship and most of the people went over to it. It was a short walk from the end of Gorman's Lane. Mother told us the timbers were very solid and smooth and polished, she supposed, with the drift sand. The ship was well in the sandhills. It was seen a year or two later, but only the top timbers. Then it disappeared and has never been seen since.
the site of the shipwreck is, of course,
A short walk from the end of Gorman's Lane.
I'm walking towards the end of Gorman's Lane, where the Sunday school picnic was held in 1876. Now I'm at the end of Gorman's Lane, and the shipwreck site is a short walk in this direction. This testimony shows that the shipwreck was finally completely buried by wind-blown sand in 1877 or 1878. Pat Madden, farmer and horse trainer who lived in Survey Lane just off Gorman's Lane, used to tell many old tales. He believed that the wreck was
East of the lane, up near the cutting. My father-in-law had a cow that calved over that way, and when he went looking, the calf could not be found. The old cow had hidden it in the tussocks. He started to drive the cow home, thinking that she would break back to the calf, but she did not. He met up with another local resident, Doherty, and asked him to look for the calf, which was soon found. The calf was tied to the wreck until it could be brought to the farm.
the wreck site, as already shown, does in fact lie
East of the lane, up near the cutting.
It seems highly unlikely that a cow and a calf could easily scale the steep hummocks to the north of the site. Is it a coincidence that there is a small pass very close by? I'm walking through the pass and it leads directly to the shipwreck site. There seem to have been very few changes in this area. Mr. Rollo's legacy includes the only exact position for a shipwreck on land in all Mahogany Ship literature. This is confirmed by using the universally accepted technique of aerial archaeology. At this precise position, Google Earth historical imagery reveals two symmetrical human-made objects that appear to be sections of a buried ship. The largest is obviously the hull. Using the Google Earth ruler, I worked out the exact distances of the two buried objects from the mahogany walking track. Then I went to the site and duplicated the measurements with a tape measure to find the positions of the buried objects. The larger outline turned out to be a hull-shaped depression in the sand. Mr. Rollo made other claims that are perfectly consistent with the geographical features of the site. The Rollo diagram shows two hummocks, lower to the south and higher to the north with a valley between. This is an accurate sketch of the landscape. The Rollo diagram shows two sections of the shipwreck on the inside slope of the south hummock. This is consistent with Google Earth historical imagery, which shows two large buried objects that are indeed under the inside slope of the south hummock. Mr. Rock's location is in complete accordance with Mr. Rollo's location. The testimonies of Mrs. Dickey, Mrs. Smith and Mr. Madden all place a shipwreck between Gorman's Lane and the cutting. It seems obvious that they would be referring to the same wreck, each in their own way. Mrs. Smith gives useful information about the date of the final disappearance under sand. There are theories that the shipwreck was burned or broken up for firewood. Keep in mind that many vessels were stranded along the Shipwreck Coast in the 19th century. There are historical records that a ship was burned by a farmer at Port Fairy. Obviously, this is not our shipwreck, as Port Fairy is some 11 kilometres away. There is another historical record of a farmer burning a shipwreck east of the cutting after 1880. This can't be our shipwreck either, since it is west of the cutting and was completely covered by sand by 1877 or 1878. Furthermore, a ship that is almost completely covered by sand can't be broken up or burned. The Warrnambool hummocks are a mysterious and beautiful place. The shipwreck needs archaeological investigation to uncover and preserve whatever remains.